The night was alive with the hum of neon lights and the faint smell of gasoline. Elias Vance stood at the edge of the gas station parking lot, his service dog, Ranger, sitting obediently at his side. The scene was ordinary, cars coming and going, the faint buzz of a vending machine, the occasional burst of laughter from a group of teenagers nearby. But the air was thick with tension, though no one else seemed to notice. Elias's sharp eyes caught the commotion first. A young woman, no older than 20, was being cornered by two officers near the convenience store entrance. Her voice trembled as she tried to explain herself, but the officers' tones grew sharper, their gestures more aggressive. Elias's jaw tightened. He knew that tone. He'd heard it before, in places far from here, in moments that still haunted him. Ranger let out a low growl, sensing his handler's unease. Elias placed a calming hand on the dog's head, but his own heart was racing. He took a step forward, then another, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The officers turned, their eyes narrowing as they took in Elias's appearance, his worn jacket, his military-grade boots, the quiet intensity in his gaze. One of them, a burly man with a buzz cut, smirked. "This doesn't concern you, pal. Move along." But Elias didn't move. He couldn't. The young woman's fear was too familiar, too raw. "She's not causing any trouble," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Why don't you let her go?" The smirk vanished, replaced by something colder. "Last warning," the officer said, stepping closer. "Walk away." Elias stood his ground. Ranger's growl deepened, his body tense. The second officer, a wiry man with a sneer, reached for his baton. "Control your dog," he snapped. Before Elias could respond, the burly officer grabbed him by the arm, twisting it roughly behind his back. Elias grunted in pain but didn't resist. Ranger lunged forward, barking fiercely, but the wiry officer swung his baton, striking the dog across the side. Ranger yelped, collapsing to the ground. "Ranger!" Elias shouted, struggling against the officer's grip. His heart pounded as he watched his dog writhe in pain. The young woman screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the blare of a police radio. "You're under arrest," the burly officer growled, slamming Elias against the hood of a patrol car. The cold metal pressed into his cheek as handcuffs snapped around his wrists. Elias's mind raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He'd served his country, fought for justice, for freedom. And now, here he was, being treated like a criminal for trying to help someone. As the officers dragged him toward the car, Elias caught one last glimpse of Ranger. The dog was struggling to stand, his eyes locked on Elias, filled with a loyalty that made Elias's chest ache. The door of the patrol car slammed shut, sealing Elias in darkness. The engine roared to life, and the car pulled away, leaving the gas station behind. But this was only the beginning. I would love to know which part of the world you are watching this video from. You should subscribe, because tomorrow's video will be something you don't want to miss. The Cedar Ridge Precinct was a fortress of fluorescent lights and cold, sterile walls. The air smelled of stale coffee and sweat, a bitter combination that clung to the back of Elias's throat as he was marched through the heavy double doors. His wrists were raw from the handcuffs, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the storm raging in his mind. Ranger. Where was Ranger? The image of his dog collapsing under the officer's baton played on a loop, fueling a quiet fury that burned in his chest. The burly officer, Officer Grady, according to his name tag, shoved Elias into a cramped holding room. The walls were a dull gray, the floor scuffed and stained. A single metal chair sat bolted to the ground, and Elias was forced into it, his cuffs now chained to a ring on the table. "You're gonna sit tight," Grady said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Someone'll be in to deal with you soon." Elias didn't respond. He kept his eyes fixed on the table, his mind racing. He needed to stay calm, to think. But the sound of Ranger's yelp echoed in his ears, making it hard to focus. The door slammed shut, leaving Elias alone in the suffocating silence. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, it was hard to tell. Finally, the door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had seen too much. His eyes were sharp, but there was a weariness in them that Elias recognized immediately. This man had been through hell. Elias Vance, the man said, his voice low and gravelly. He held a file in his hands, flipping through it with deliberate slowness. Decorated veteran. 2 tours overseas. Honorable discharge. And now, this. He gestured vaguely at the room, as if the dingy walls and chained table were Elias's fault. Who are you? Elias asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. The man hesitated, then pulled out a chair and sat down across from Elias. Arthur Jenkins, he said. Well, let's just say I'm someone who knows how this place works. Elias studied him carefully. There was something about Jenkins, something that didn't fit. His posture was too relaxed, his tone too casual. But his eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much, who had been broken and put back together too many times. You're a vet too, Elias said, more statement than question. Jenkins nodded. Afghanistan. 2 tours, just like you. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Listen, Vance. I know you didn't ask for this. But you're in deep now. And if you want to get out of here with your dog and your freedom, you're gonna need to play this smart. Elias's chest tightened at the mention of Ranger. Where is he? He demanded. What did they do to him? Jenkins held up a hand. He's alive. For now. But if you start making trouble, that could change real quick. Elias's fists clenched, the chains rattling against the table. What do you want from me? Jenkins sighed, running a hand over his face. I want to help you. But you need to understand something. This precinct, it's not what you think. It's not about justice. It's about power. And if you cross the wrong people, you'll disappear. Just like that. He snapped his fingers for emphasis. Elias stared at him, his mind racing. He didn't trust Jenkins, not fully. But he didn't have many options. What do I need to do? Before Jenkins could answer, the door opened again, and a woman stepped inside. She was younger than Jenkins, with sharp features and piercing green eyes. Her uniform was immaculate, but there was a tension in her shoulders that betrayed her calm exterior. Officer Hayes, Jenkins said, nodding at her. This is Elias Vance. Hayes glanced at Elias, her expression unreadable. I've read the report, she said, her voice clipped. Resisting arrest. Assaulting an officer. Not a great start. Elias bristled. I didn't assault anyone. I was trying to help that girl. Hayes raised an eyebrow. That's not what the report says. Of course it's not, Elias shot back. Because they're lying. Hayes exchanged a look with Jenkins, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. Look, she said, her tone softening slightly. I get it. You think you're the hero here. But this isn't the movies. If you keep pushing, you're only going to make things worse for yourself. Elias leaned back in his chair, his chains clinking against the table. So what? I'm just supposed to sit here and take it. Hayes hesitated, her eyes flickering to Jenkins before returning to Elias. No, she said quietly. But you need to be smart about this. You're not the first person to get caught up in this mess. And if you're not careful, you won't be the last. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Elias looked from Hayes to Jenkins, trying to piece together what was really going on. There was something they weren't telling him, something big. What aren't you saying? he asked finally. Jenkins and Hayes exchanged another glance. Then Jenkins leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. This precinct, it's rotten. From the top down. And if you're not careful, it'll chew you up and spit you out. Elias's heart pounded. He had known something was off from the moment he'd been arrested. But hearing it confirmed sent a chill down his spine. So what do I do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenkins hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. He slid it across the table to Elias. Memorize this number, he said. And when the time comes, use it. Elias glanced down at the paper. It was a phone number, scrawled in messy handwriting. He looked up at Jenkins, 1,000 questions on the tip of his tongue. But before he could ask any of them, the door opened again, and Officer Grady stepped inside. Time's up, Grady said, his voice dripping with disdain. Let's go, Vance. Jenkins and Hayes stood, their expressions carefully neutral. As Elias was led out of the room, he caught one last glimpse of Jenkins, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. The message was clear, this wasn't over. The holding cell was cold, the concrete floor leaching the warmth from Elias's body as he sat with his back against the wall. His mind wandered, not for the first time, to the life he'd left behind. The life he'd fought so hard to build after the war. It had started with a simple dream, peace. Not the kind of peace that came from silence, but the kind that came from belonging. From having a place where he could breathe without the weight of the world pressing down on him. Cedar Ridge had seemed like that place. The sun was setting over Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows across the small town. Elias stood on the porch of his new home, a modest house on the edge of town with a sprawling backyard. Ranger sat at his feet, his tail thumping against the wooden planks as he watched a squirrel dart across the yard. It's not much, Elias said, more to himself than to the dog. But it's ours. The move had been a leap of faith. After years of drifting, of trying to outrun the memories of war, Elias had decided to plant roots. Cedar Ridge had seemed like the perfect place, quiet, unassuming, a town where he could disappear into the rhythm of everyday life. But even then, there had been signs. The first time he'd walked into the local diner, the chatter had died down, replaced by wary glances. The waitress had been polite, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. When he'd asked about the town, she'd shrugged and said, "It's quiet. You'll like it here." Quiet. That word again. Elias had brushed it off, chalking it up to small-town wariness. But as the weeks turned into months, he began to notice things. The way the police cruisers seemed to linger on his street. The way the neighbors avoided his gaze. The way the town felt less like a community and more like a fortress, its walls built on secrets and silence. Still, he tried to make it work. He'd found a job at the local garage, fixing cars and keeping to himself. He'd even started to build a tentative friendship with his neighbor, an elderly man named Frank who liked to sit on his porch and tell stories about the good old days. But the peace he'd been searching for remained elusive. The sound of a door slamming jolted Elias back to the present. He blinked, the cold reality of the holding cell crashing down around him. Ranger was still out there, hurt and alone. And he was stuck in this hellhole, surrounded by people who seemed determined to break him. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. The memory of his sister, Elena, flashed in his mind. She'd been the one to convince him to move to Cedar Ridge. "You need a fresh start," she'd said, her voice firm but kind. "Somewhere you can rebuild. Somewhere you can be happy." Elias had laughed at that. Happy. It had seemed like such a foreign concept at the time. But he'd agreed, partly because he didn't have the energy to argue and partly because he'd wanted to believe her. Now, sitting in that cell, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. Elena had always been the strong one. Even as kids, she'd been the one to stand up to bullies, to fight for what was right. When Elias had come back from his second tour, broken and lost, she'd been the one to pull him back from the edge. "You're not alone," she'd said, her voice fierce. "You've got me. And you've got Ranger. We'll get through this together." And for a while, they had. But then life had gotten in the way. Elena had her own struggles, a demanding job, a rocky relationship, the constant pressure to keep everything together. They'd drifted apart, their conversations becoming shorter and less frequent. The last time they'd spoken, Elias had told her about Cedar Ridge. "It's quiet," he'd said, echoing the waitress's words. "I think I can make it work here." Elena had hesitated, her silence speaking volumes. Then she'd sighed and said, "Just be careful, okay? Not every town is what it seems." At the time, Elias had brushed it off. But now, sitting in that cell, her words echoed in his mind like a warning. The sound of footsteps pulled Elias from his thoughts. He looked up as the cell door creaked open, revealing Officer Hayes. She looked different now, softer, almost apologetic. "I brought you some water," she said, holding out a plastic cup. Elias took it, his fingers brushing against hers. For a moment, their eyes met, and he saw something in hers, conflict, maybe even guilt. "Thank you," he said quietly. Hayes nodded, then hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if checking to see if anyone was watching. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I know this isn't right. What happened to you? It's not how things are supposed to be." Elias frowned, studying her face. "Then why are you letting it happen?" Hayes looked away, her jaw tightening. "It's complicated. But I'm not like them. I need you to know that." Before Elias could respond, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, battered cell phone. She pressed it into his hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "You get one call," she said, her voice barely audible. "Make it count." Elias stared at the phone, his heart pounding. He didn't ask questions. He didn't have time. Instead, he quickly dialed the number he knew by heart. The phone rang once, twice, then. "Elias?" Elena's voice was sharp with worry. "Where are you? Are you okay?" "Elena," Elias said, his voice cracking. "I'm in trouble. Cedar Ridge, it's not what I thought. They've got me locked up, and Ranger." "Ranger? What happened to Ranger?" Elena's tone shifted from worry to panic. "He's hurt," Elias said, his throat tightening. "They hit him, Elena. I don't know where he is or if he's okay. I need your help." There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, Elias thought the call had dropped. Then Elena spoke again, her voice steady and determined. "I'm coming. Just hang on, okay? I'll figure this out." The line went dead, and Elias lowered the phone, his hands shaking. He looked up at Hayes, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. "Thank you," he said again, his voice raw. Hayes nodded, then took the phone back, slipping it into her pocket. "Be careful," she said quietly. "And don't tell anyone about this." She turned and walked away, leaving Elias alone in the cell. But for the first time since his arrest, he felt a flicker of hope. Elena was coming. And if there was one person in the world who could fix this, it was her. Have you ever witnessed or experienced an unjust arrest? Share your story in the comments. Your voice matters, and it could help others feel less alone in their struggles. What would you do if you saw someone being mistreated by the police? Comment below. Your perspective could spark an important conversation about justice and accountability. If you're enjoying this content and want to see how Elias's story unfolds, please like and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Let me know if you'd like to refine this further or proceed with the next part of the story. Cedar Ridge wasn't always a town shrouded in darkness. Decades ago, It had been a thriving community, a place where families built lives and neighbors looked out for one another. But somewhere along the way, the town's soul had been hollowed out, replaced by a quiet, insidious rot that seeped into every corner. At the center of it all was Sheriff Marcus Thorne. Thorne wasn't just a lawman, he was a kingpin. His family had deep roots in Cedar Ridge, stretching back generations. His grandfather had been the town's first sheriff, and his father had held the position for nearly 30 years. By the time Marcus took over, the Thorne name was synonymous with power. But Marcus wasn't content to simply uphold the law. He wanted to control it. When Marcus first became sheriff, he'd been a different man, young, ambitious, and full of ideals. He'd promised to clean up the town, to rid it of the petty crime and corruption that had begun to take hold. And for a while, it seemed like he might succeed. But power has a way of changing people. It started small. A favor here, a bribe there. A blind eye turned to a friend's indiscretion. But over time, the lines blurred, and Marcus found himself sinking deeper into the muck. By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. He was in too deep. Now, Marcus ruled Cedar Ridge with an iron fist. The police department was his personal army, and the town's residents were his subjects. Those who crossed him disappeared, sometimes literally. Others were silenced through intimidation or threats. The system was rigged, and everyone knew it. Elias Vance wasn't the first person to fall victim to Cedar Ridge's corruption. He was just the latest in a long line of casualties. There was Sarah Mitchell, a single mother who'd been arrested for resisting arrest after she'd questioned why her son had been pulled over for no reason. She'd spent 3 days in jail before being released with no charges. But the damage had been done. She'd lost her job, and her son had dropped out of school, too traumatized to return. Then there was James Carter, a local mechanic who'd been accused of stealing tools from his own shop. The evidence had been planted, of course, but no one dared to question it. James had spent 6 months in prison before the charges were mysteriously dropped. By then, his business had collapsed, and he'd been forced to leave town. And then there was Arthur Jenkins. Arthur had been a decorated veteran, just like Elias. He'd served 2 tours overseas and had come home hoping to find peace. Instead, he'd found Cedar Ridge. When Arthur had tried to expose the corruption, he'd been framed for a crime he didn't commit. The evidence against him had been overwhelming, and the trial had been a sham. He'd been sentenced to 10 years in prison, but he'd only served 2 before being released on good behavior. The truth was, Marcus had let him go because he'd become a liability. Arthur knew too much, and keeping him locked up was too risky. Now, Arthur lived in the shadows, a broken man with nothing left to lose. The people of Cedar Ridge knew better than to speak out. They'd seen what happened to those who did. The police department was a well-oiled machine, designed to crush dissent and maintain control. Officers were rewarded for loyalty and punished for disobedience. Those who questioned orders were reassigned to desk duty or forced out altogether. The few who tried to fight back were met with swift and brutal retaliation. Homes were vandalized. Cars were towed. Jobs were lost. And if that didn't work, there were always more extreme measures. The message was clear: cross Marcus Thorne, and you'll regret it. Elias's arrest had been a warning, a reminder to the town that no one was above the law, not even a decorated veteran. But it had also been a mistake. Elias wasn't like the others. He wasn't afraid of Marcus Thorne, and he wasn't going to disappear quietly. He had a sister who wouldn't stop until she found the truth, and a dog who'd already proven his loyalty. And now, he had a phone call. Elena arrived in Cedar Ridge 2 days later, her car packed with notebooks, recording equipment, and a determination that bordered on obsession. She'd spent the drive researching the town, digging into its history, its politics, its people. What she'd found was troubling. Cedar Ridge was a town with secrets. She checked into a motel on the outskirts of town, a dingy place with flickering neon lights and a front desk clerk who eyed her with suspicion. The room was small and smelled faintly of mildew, but it would do. She didn't plan on spending much time there anyway. Her first stop was the Cedar Ridge Police Department. The precinct was a squat, unassuming building with a faded flag hanging limply out front. Elena parked her car across the street and sat for a moment, studying the building. It looked harmless enough, but she knew better. She grabbed her bag and walked inside, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. The reception area was empty except for a bored-looking officer behind the desk. He glanced up as she approached, his expression wary. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he'd rather not. Elena flashed her press badge, her smile polite but firm. "Elena Vance, Chronicle Times. I'd like to speak with Sheriff Thorne, please." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Sheriff's busy. You'll have to make an appointment." "I'm sure he'll want to make time for me," Elena said, her tone sweet but with an edge of steel. "I'm here to talk about my brother, Elias Vance. He was arrested a few days ago." The officer's expression didn't change, but she saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He picked up the phone and muttered something into the receiver, his eyes never leaving hers. A few minutes later, a door opened, and a man stepped into the reception area. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His eyes were cold, calculating, and they locked onto Elena with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice smooth but with an undercurrent of menace. "I'm Sheriff Marcus Thorne. What can I do for you?" Elena met his gaze without flinching. "I'm here about my brother, Elias Vance. I'd like to know why he was arrested and where his dog is." Thorne's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Your brother was arrested for resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. As for the dog, I'm afraid I don't know anything about that." Elena's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice calm. "I'd like to see him." "That's not possible," Thorne said, his tone final. "He's being held pending trial. You'll have to speak with his lawyer." Elena didn't back down. "And who would that be?" Thorne's smile widened, but it was anything but friendly. "I'm sure you'll figure it out. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." He turned and walked away, leaving Elena standing in the reception area, her fists clenched at her sides. Elena spent the next few days digging into Cedar Ridge's underbelly. She started with public records, pulling everything she could find on the police department, the sheriff, and the town's history. What she found was disturbing. Complaints against the police department had been piling up for years, but none of them had gone anywhere. Officers accused of brutality, evidence tampering, even murder. But every time, the cases were dismissed or buried. She also found a pattern. Many of the victims were outsiders, people who didn't fit into Cedar Ridge's tight-knit community. People like Elias. But the most troubling discovery was Sheriff Thorne's connection to a local construction company that had been awarded several lucrative government contracts. The company had a history of violations, but somehow, they always managed to avoid consequences. Elena knew she was onto something, but she needed more. Her breakthrough came in the form of Arthur Jenkins. Elena had heard his name mentioned in passing during her research, but it wasn't until she tracked him down that she realized how important he was. Arthur was a broken man, his face lined with pain and regret. But when Elena mentioned Elias, his eyes lit up with a fierce determination. "Your brother's a good man," Arthur said, his voice rough. "He didn't deserve what happened to him. None of us did." Elena leaned forward, her notebook open in front of her. "Tell me everything." And he did. Arthur told her about the corruption, the intimidation, the fear. He told her about the victims, people like Sarah Mitchell and James Carter. And he told her about Sheriff Thorne, the man who destroyed his life. By the time he was finished, Elena's hands were shaking with anger. But she also felt a flicker of hope. Arthur's story was the key to exposing the truth. Elena's husband, Daniel, was a private investigator with a knack for uncovering secrets. When she called him that night, her voice trembling with excitement, he didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way," he said. Daniel arrived the next day, his car packed with surveillance equipment and a determination that matched Elena's. Together, they began piecing together the puzzle. Daniel's skills complemented Elena's perfectly. While she focused on the paper trail, he dug into the human element. He interviewed witnesses, followed leads, and even managed to get his hands on some damning surveillance footage. One night, as they sat in their motel room surrounded by files and notes, Daniel turned to Elena, his expression grim. "This goes deeper than we thought," he said. "Thorne's not just corrupt, he's dangerous. If we're going to take him down, we need to be careful." Elena nodded, her jaw set. "We will be. But we're not stopping until we expose the truth." As Elena and Daniel dug deeper, they began to feel the weight of the town's corruption pressing down on them. Strange cars followed them at night. Their motel room was searched while they were out. And then there were the phone calls, silent, menacing, and always in the dead of night. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. Every piece of evidence they uncovered brought them closer to the truth, but it also brought them closer to danger. They knew they were being watched, that Thorne's men were closing in. But they also knew they were running out of time. Elias was still in jail, and Ranger's fate was unknown. Every day they spent investigating was another day Elias spent behind bars. The pressure was mounting, and the stakes were higher than ever. Officer Clara Hayes had always believed in the law. Growing up, she'd idolized the police officers in her small town, seeing them as protectors, as heroes. When she joined the Cedar Ridge Police Department, she'd been filled with a sense of purpose, a determination to make a difference. But that was before she saw the truth. Clara's unease had started small, almost imperceptible. It was the little things, the way certain cases were handled, the way evidence seemed to disappear, the way some officers acted with impunity. At first, she told herself it was just the way things were. Every department had its flaws, after all. But then came the incident with Elias Vance. Clara had been on duty the night Elias was arrested. She hadn't been part of the arrest itself, but she'd seen the aftermath, the way Elias was dragged into the precinct, the way Ranger was treated, the way the officers laughed and joked about it afterward. It had made her sick. She tried to push it out of her mind, to focus on her work. But the image of Elias's face, angry, defiant, but also deeply hurt, stayed with her. And then there was Ranger. The dog had been taken to the pound, his condition unknown. Clara had wanted to check on him, but she knew better than to draw attention to herself. Instead, she'd done the only thing she could, she'd given Elias a phone. It was a small act of rebellion, but it had weighed heavily on her conscience. She knew the risks. If anyone found out, she'd be finished. But she couldn't stand by and do nothing. Clara's breaking point came a few days later. She was in the evidence room, cataloging items from a recent arrest, when she overheard a conversation between two officers. They were laughing, their voices low but carrying in the quiet room. "Did you see the look on his face?" one of them said. "Like he actually thought he could take us on." "Yeah, well, he learned the hard way," the other replied. "Thorne's not gonna let some outsider come in and mess things up." Clara froze, her heart pounding. She knew they were talking about Elias. "What about the dog?" the first officer asked. "Thorne's got plans for him," the second said, his tone dark. "Let's just say he's not gonna be a problem much longer." Clara's stomach churned. She wanted to confront them, to demand answers, but she knew it would be suicide. Instead, she forced herself to stay quiet, to keep working as if she hadn't heard a thing. But inside, she was seething. That night, Clara lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced, replaying the conversation she'd overheard, the things she'd seen, the things she'd ignored. She couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine, that the department was just flawed but ultimately good. It wasn't. It was rotten to the core, and she was part of it. But what could she do? The answer came to her in the early hours of the morning, as the first light of dawn crept through her window. She would help Elias's sister. She would help Elena Vance. It was a risky move, but it was the only one she had. Clara arranged to meet Elena at a small diner on the edge of town, a place where they were unlikely to be recognized. She arrived early, her nerves on edge, and ordered a cup of coffee she didn't touch. When Elena walked in, Clara recognized her immediately. She had the same sharp features as Elias, the same determined look in her eyes. "Officer Hayes," Elena said as she sat down, her tone cautious but not unfriendly. "Clara, please," Clara replied, forcing a smile. "Thank you for meeting me." Elena nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What's this about?" Clara took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I know about your brother. I was there the night he was arrested." Elena's expression hardened. And I know what's really going on in this town," Clara said, her voice low. "I know about Sheriff Thorne, about the corruption, about the people he's hurt. And I want to help you expose it." Elena studied her for a moment, her gaze piercing. "Why should I trust you?" Clara met her eyes, her own filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Because I can't live with myself if I don't do something. Because your brother deserves justice. And because I'm tired of being part of the problem." There was a long silence as Elena considered her words. Then she nodded, her expression softening slightly. "All right. Let's talk." Over the next hour, Clara told Elena everything she knew. She talked about Thorne's connections to Ridgeline Construction, about the bribes, the cover-ups, the intimidation. She talked about the victims, people like Sarah Mitchell and James Carter, and the way the department had silenced them. And she talked about Elias. "They're planning to make an example of him," Clara said, her voice trembling. "They're going to charge him with assault and resisting arrest, and they're going to make sure he gets the maximum sentence. And Ranger, they're going to put him down." Elena's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. "But if we can get the evidence out there, if we can expose Thorne and his network, we can stop them," Clara continued. "We can save your brother. And we can bring this town back from the brink." Elena nodded, her mind racing. "What do you need from me?" "Access," Clara said. "I can get you the files, the records, the proof. But you're the journalist. You're the one who can get the story out there." Elena leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "It's risky. For both of us." "I know," Clara said. "But it's the only way." There was another long silence. Then Elena reached across the table, her hand closing over Clara's. "All right. Let's do this." Over the next few days, Clara and Elena worked together in secret, gathering evidence and piecing together the story. Clara used her access to the department's files to pull records, while Elena and her husband, Daniel, worked on the outside, interviewing witnesses and following leads. But the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Clara began to notice things: strange cars parked outside her apartment, officers giving her sidelong glances, whispers in the precinct that stopped when she walked into the room. She knew she was being watched, that Thorne's men were closing in. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Every piece of evidence they uncovered brought them closer to the truth, but it also brought them closer to danger. They knew they were running out of time. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source, Arthur Jenkins. Clara had heard about Arthur from Elena, but it wasn't until she met him in person that she realized how important he was. Arthur was a broken man, but he was also a determined one. He had been a victim of Thorne's corruption, and he was willing to do whatever it took to bring him down. "I've got something," Arthur said when they met in a secluded park on the edge of town. He handed Clara a USB drive, his hands trembling slightly. "It's everything. Bank records, contracts, even some audio recordings. It's enough to bring Thorne down." Clara took the drive, her heart pounding. "Where did you get this?" Arthur shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Just make sure it gets out there." Clara nodded, her mind racing. She knew what this meant. They had the evidence. They had the story. Now, they just had to survive long enough to tell it. The USB drive was Elena's secret weapon. It wasn't just a storage device, it was a sophisticated piece of technology designed to infiltrate and extract every document, email, and file from a target's computer. It had been a gift from a tech-savvy contact in her journalism network, and Elena had been waiting for the right moment to use it. That moment had come. But before they could act, they needed to ensure the evidence reached the right hands. That's where Colonel Richard Holt came in. Elias had been given Colonel Holt's contact information during his time in the military. Holt was a decorated officer with a reputation for rooting out corruption, and Elias had trusted him implicitly. When Elena found the crumpled piece of paper with Holt's number in Elias's belongings, she knew it was their lifeline. "Colonel Holt has been following the case," Elena explained to Clara and Daniel as they sat in the safe house. "He's been building a file on Thorne for years, but he's never had enough evidence to move forward. This USB could be the break he needs." Clara nodded, her expression tense. "But first, we need to get the evidence. And that means getting into Thorne's office." The next morning, Clara arrived at the precinct, the USB drive hidden in the inner pocket of her uniform. Her heart pounded as she walked through the familiar halls, nodding to her colleagues as if nothing was wrong. Thorne's office was at the end of the hall, a large, imposing room with a heavy wooden door. Clara knew he was in a meeting with the town council, which gave her a narrow window of opportunity. She approached the door, her hands trembling slightly, and knocked. When there was no answer, she pushed it open and slipped inside. The office was exactly as she'd expected, neat, organized, and filled with the trappings of power. A large mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface cluttered with papers and a sleek, high-end laptop. Clara moved quickly, her training kicking in. She plugged the USB into the laptop and waited as the bug did its work. The screen flickered briefly, and then a small progress bar appeared, indicating that the files were being copied. Every second felt like an eternity. Clara's eyes darted to the door, her ears straining for any sound of approaching footsteps. She could feel the weight of the precinct pressing down on her, the fear of discovery gnawing at her nerves. Just as the progress bar reached 80%, she heard voices outside the door. Her heart leapt into her throat as the handle turned. Thinking fast, Clara yanked the USB out of the laptop and slipped it into her pocket. She grabbed a stack of papers from the desk and pretended to be sorting through them as the door swung open. Sheriff Thorne stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he saw her. "Officer Hayes," he said, his voice cold. "What are you doing in my office?" Clara forced a calm smile, though her heart was racing. "I'm sorry, Sheriff. I was looking for the quarterly report. I thought you might need it for the meeting." Thorne's gaze flicked to the papers in her hands, then back to her face. "And you couldn't wait until I was done?" "I didn't want to interrupt," Clara said, her tone apologetic. "I know how important the meeting is." For a moment, Thorne just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped aside, gesturing for her to leave. "Next time, wait for permission." Clara nodded, her relief barely concealed. "Of course, Sheriff. My apologies." She walked out of the office, her legs trembling beneath her. As she turned the corner, she let out a shaky breath, her mind racing. That had been too close. That night, Elena, Clara, and Daniel gathered in the safe house, the USB drive now in their possession. They plugged it into Daniel's laptop and watched as the files began to load. What they found was staggering. The USB had extracted thousands of documents, bank records, contracts, emails, and even video files. It was a treasure trove of evidence, detailing Thorne's corruption in excruciating detail. There were records of bribes paid to local politicians, contracts awarded to Ridgeline Construction in exchange for kickbacks, and even emails discussing the intimidation and silencing of witnesses. But the most damning evidence was a series of video files. One showed Thorne meeting with the CEO of Ridgeline Construction in a dimly lit room, the two men discussing the next phase of their business arrangement. "We need to make sure this project goes through," Thorne said, his voice calm but commanding. "If anyone gets in the way, we deal with them. Permanently." The CEO nodded, his expression grim. "Understood." Another video showed Thorne accepting a briefcase full of cash from a man Elena recognized as a local judge. "This should cover the next phase," the man said, his tone casual, as if he were discussing a routine business transaction. Thorne smiled, his eyes glinting with greed. "Pleasure doing business with you." Elena felt a surge of anger as she watched the footage. This wasn't just corruption, it was a criminal enterprise, and Thorne was at the center of it. With the evidence in hand, Elena contacted Colonel Richard Holt. She sent him the files via a secure, encrypted server, along with a detailed explanation of the situation. Holt responded within hours. "This is exactly what we've been waiting for," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'll mobilize a team immediately. Be ready, this is going to get messy." A few days later, as Elena, Clara, and Daniel worked in the safe house, they heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside. Clara peered through the window, her heart sinking as she saw two black SUVs pull up. "It's Thorne," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's found us." Elena's mind raced. They couldn't fight, and they couldn't run. But they also couldn't let Thorne get his hands on the evidence. "Get the files," she said, her voice low but urgent. "We need to upload them to the cloud. Now." Daniel grabbed his laptop and began frantically typing, while Clara stood guard by the door. Elena grabbed her phone and dialed Holt's number. "We've got company," she said when he answered. "Hold on," Holt replied. "Help's on the way." The sound of footsteps outside grew louder, and then the door burst open. Thorne stood in the doorway, his face twisted with rage. Behind him were two of his men, their guns drawn. "You think you can take me down?" Thorne snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You're nothing but a bunch of amateurs." Elena stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. "It's over, Thorne. The feds are already on their way." Thorne laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You really think they can stop me? I own this town. I own everyone in it." But before he could say more, the sound of sirens filled the air. Thorne's men turned, their expressions panicked, as a swarm of federal agents descended on the safe house. Holt stepped forward, his face grim. "Marcus Thorne, you're under arrest." Thorne's arrest sent shockwaves through Cedar Ridge. The town's residents, long cowed by fear and intimidation, began to speak out. Stories of corruption, abuse, and injustice poured in, each one adding to the mountain of evidence against Thorne and his network. The federal investigation expanded, uncovering a web of corruption that reached far beyond Cedar Ridge. Business owners, politicians, and even judges were implicated, their lavish lifestyles funded by illegal activities. Elias was released from jail, his charges dropped. Ranger was found alive, though badly injured, and was rushed to a veterinary hospital. Elena, Clara, and Daniel watched from the sidelines as the town began to heal. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but for the first time in years, there was hope. The arrest of Sheriff Marcus Thorne and the subsequent federal intervention sent shockwaves through Cedar Ridge. For years, the town had lived under the shadow of corruption, its residents too afraid to speak out. But now, with Thorne behind bars and his network dismantled, the community began to awaken. The news of Thorne's arrest spread quickly, fueled by local news outlets and social media. At first, there was disbelief. Many residents had lived under Thorne's rule for so long that they couldn't imagine a Cedar Ridge without him. But as the details of the investigation emerged, the bribes, the kickbacks, the intimidation, the disbelief turned to anger. People began to gather in the town square, their voices rising in a chorus of outrage. "We've been living in fear for too long," one man shouted, his face red with emotion. "It's time we take our town back." The crowd erupted in cheers, their anger giving way to a sense of empowerment. For the first time in years, the people of Cedar Ridge felt like they had a voice. Arthur Jenkins stood at the edge of the crowd, his expression a mixture of relief and bitterness. He had been one of Thorne's first victims, his life destroyed by the sheriff's corruption. As he listened to the speeches, Arthur felt a surge of emotion. He had waited years for this moment, for the chance to see Thorne brought to justice. But now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to feel. "It's not enough," he muttered to himself. "It'll never be enough." But even as he said the words, Arthur knew that this was a step in the right direction. Thorne's arrest was a victory, not just for him, but for all the victims who had suffered in silence. Not everyone in the Cedar Ridge Police Department had been corrupt. There were officers who had joined the force to serve and protect, only to find themselves trapped in a system that rewarded loyalty over integrity. For these officers, Thorne's arrest was a chance to start over. Officer Clara Hayes stood among her colleagues, her heart heavy with mixed emotions. She had risked everything to bring Thorne down, and now that it was over, she wasn't sure what came next. "We've got a lot of work to do," she said to the group, her voice steady but filled with determination. "The people of this town deserve better. And it's up to us to make sure they get it." The other officers nodded, their expressions grim but resolute. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they were ready to face it. As the federal investigation continued, more and more victims came forward to share their stories. Sarah Mitchell, the single mother who had been arrested for resisting arrest, stood before the crowd, her voice trembling but strong. "I lost everything because of Thorne," she said, her eyes filled with tears. "But I'm not afraid anymore. And I'm not going to let him take anything else from me." The crowd erupted in applause, their support giving Sarah the strength to continue. James Carter, the mechanic who had been framed for theft, was next. "I lost my business, my home, my dignity," he said, his voice filled with anger. "But I'm still here. And I'm not going anywhere." One by one, the victims shared their stories, their voices rising in a powerful chorus of resilience and hope. The dismantling of the corrupt police department was just the first step in Cedar Ridge's healing process. The town had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, there was hope. Community meetings were held to discuss the future of the town, and new leaders emerged to guide the way. The police department was restructured, with a focus on transparency and accountability. And through it all, the people of Cedar Ridge stood together, united in their determination to rebuild. Elias Vance had always been a fighter. From his days in the military to his time in Cedar Ridge, he had faced countless challenges with courage and determination. But nothing could have prepared him for the ordeal he had just endured. Elias's release from jail was a moment of triumph, but it was also the beginning of a long and difficult journey. Physically, he was battered and bruised, his body bearing the scars of his mistreatment. But it was the emotional wounds that ran the deepest. The first few days were the hardest. Elias struggled to adjust to life outside of jail, his mind haunted by the memories of what he had been through. He found it difficult to sleep, his dreams filled with images of Thorne and his men. But he wasn't alone. Elena was by his side every step of the way, her presence a constant source of comfort and strength. She helped him navigate the legal process, ensuring that his record was cleared and his name was restored. And then there was Ranger. Ranger had been Elias's constant companion, his loyalty unwavering even in the face of danger. But the dog had suffered greatly during their ordeal, his body battered and his spirit broken. When Elias was finally reunited with Ranger, it was an emotional moment. The dog limped toward him, his tail wagging weakly, and Elias dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry." Ranger nuzzled against him, his trust and love undiminished. The road to recovery was long, but with the help of a dedicated veterinarian and Elias's unwavering care, Ranger began to heal. His wounds closed, his strength returned, and his spirit slowly mended. As Elias and Ranger healed, they became symbols of resistance and hope for the people of Cedar Ridge. Elias's story spread throughout the town, inspiring others to stand up against injustice. He was invited to speak at community meetings, his words filled with passion and determination. "We've been through hell," he said, his voice strong and steady. "But we're still here. And we're not going to let anyone take our town away from us again." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a testament to the impact of Elias's words. Elias's legacy extended far beyond Cedar Ridge. His story was picked up by national news outlets, shining a spotlight on the corruption and injustice that had plagued the town. But for Elias, the most important thing was the impact he had on the people around him. He became a mentor to young veterans, helping them navigate the challenges of returning to civilian life. He worked with local organizations to support victims of police brutality and corruption. And through it all, he remained a steadfast advocate for justice and accountability. The healing of Cedar Ridge was a slow and difficult process, but it was also a testament to the resilience of its people. The town came together to rebuild, their shared experiences forging a bond that could not be broken. New leaders emerged, their focus on transparency and accountability guiding the way. And through it all, Elias and Ranger stood as symbols of hope, their journey a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a way forward. The events in Cedar Ridge were not just a local story, they were a microcosm of a much larger issue. The corruption, the abuse of power, and the eventual triumph of justice had far-reaching implications, sparking conversations about accountability, reform, and the importance of standing up against injustice. The dismantling of Sheriff Marcus Thorne's corrupt regime was a victory, but it also exposed the systemic flaws that allowed such corruption to thrive in the first place. Cedar Ridge was not an isolated case, it was a symptom of a much larger problem. One of the most significant lessons from Cedar Ridge was the importance of accountability in law enforcement. For years, Thorne and his officers had operated with impunity, their actions unchecked by any meaningful oversight. The federal intervention highlighted the need for robust mechanisms to hold law enforcement accountable. This included independent oversight bodies, transparent reporting systems, and consequences for those who abused their power. Accountability isn't just about punishing the bad actors, Elena said in an interview after the events. It's about creating a system where corruption can't take root in the first place. Another key takeaway was the need for better training for police officers, particularly in small towns where resources were often limited. Many of the officers in Cedar Ridge had joined the force with good intentions but had been corrupted by a system that rewarded loyalty over integrity. Training isn't just about teaching officers how to use their weapons, Clara Hayes explained. It's about teaching them how to de-escalate situations, how to build trust with the community, and how to recognize and resist corruption. The restructuring of the Cedar Ridge Police Department included a focus on training, with an emphasis on ethics, community policing, and de-escalation techniques. Small towns like Cedar Ridge often flew under the radar, their police departments operating with little to no oversight. This lack of scrutiny created an environment where corruption could thrive. The events in Cedar Ridge underscored the need for greater oversight of small-town policing. This included regular audits, federal monitoring, and mechanisms for residents to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. "We can't let small towns become breeding grounds for corruption," Colonel Richard Holt said in a press conference. Every community, no matter how small, deserves transparency and accountability. Perhaps the most important lesson was the role of the community in holding law enforcement accountable. The people of Cedar Ridge had been cowed by fear for years, but once they found their voice, they became a powerful force for change. Community involvement was crucial in ensuring that the reforms in Cedar Ridge were lasting. This included citizen oversight boards, community policing initiatives, and open dialogues between law enforcement and residents. The community is the backbone of any police department, Elias Vance said in a speech at a town hall meeting. When we stand together, we can demand better. And we deserve better. The story of Cedar Ridge was not just about corruption and injustice, it was about resistance. It was about ordinary people standing up against extraordinary odds and fighting for what was right. At the heart of the resistance was the power of truth. Elena's investigative journalism, Clara's courage, and Elias's unwavering determination had exposed the corruption and brought it to light. The truth is the most powerful weapon we have, Elena said in an interview. No matter how deep the corruption runs, the truth will always find a way to the surface. The events in Cedar Ridge were a testament to the power of truth. They showed that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the truth could prevail. Elias Vance became a symbol of hope for the people of Cedar Ridge. His journey from victim to advocate inspired others to stand up against injustice and demand accountability. Elias showed us that we don't have to be afraid, Sarah Mitchell said in a community meeting. He showed us that we have the power to fight back. Elias's legacy extended far beyond Cedar Ridge. His story was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. What do you believe is the most important step in preventing police corruption? Share your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear your perspective. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Together, we can spread awareness and inspire change. Thank you for watching. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this to light. Stay tuned for our next episode.